I'll never forget the day I nearly lost my town to a Karen. Sounds dramatic, right? But trust me, it's true. It all started when one woman's obsession with a gate almost led to a full-blown disaster. You're probably wondering how a simple locked gate could cause all that chaos. Well, sit tight, because the story is wild. It was just another quiet Monday morning. I was sipping my coffee, enjoying the peace, and watching my dog Ripley patrol the yard like he was guarding Fort Knox. I had just started fixing up the chicken coop when I saw her. Karen. She was marching down the gravel road like she was on a mission, sunglasses so oversized she looked like an anime villain, and holding a clipboard with the seriousness of a government official. Now, I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, who hasn't seen someone walking down the road with a clipboard, right? But when I saw her heading straight for my gate, that's when I started to get suspicious. I watched as she came closer, and then it hit me. She wasn't just strolling by. She was coming for the gate. I could see the determined look on her face as she fumbled around in her bag. She pulled out a shiny silver padlock and snapped it onto the gate like she was planting a flag. Before I could even shout, "Hey, what are you doing?" she was already turning away and walking off like she had just solved some great mystery. I jogged up to her, dust kicking up behind me, my mind racing. I had to stay calm. "Hey, did you just lock my gate?" I asked. She didn't flinch, didn't even look at me. "Yes, I did," she said, holding up her clipboard like it was a badge of honor. Per HOA Ordinance 14B, no unapproved front-facing structures may remain unlocked. I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. "This isn't a front-facing structure," I replied, trying to stay composed. "It's a private access gate, on a private easement." But Karen wasn't having it. She smiled at me like I was the one who didn't understand. "That's what you think, but it's clearly visible from the community trail. It's an eyesore." She paused for dramatic effect, as if this was some sort of grand revelation. "I've submitted multiple complaints and taken the liberty of securing it myself." At that moment, I couldn't help but wonder if I was in some sort of twisted version of reality where a gate could be so offensive to someone. "You submitted complaints about my gate?" I asked, completely baffled. She nodded like a teacher proud of her student for finally catching up. "Yes, multiple complaints." I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Of course, I knew the gate was visible from the trail. It was right there on the edge of my property. But what she didn't know was that this gate wasn't just some decorative obstacle. It was crucial. I couldn't just pull out a pair of bolt cutters or rip it off with my ATV. Not yet anyway. Not because I was afraid of her. Karen wasn't exactly intimidating, but because under that gravel patch behind the gate was something much more important. The town's emergency water valve. A valve that had been installed after the 2017 flood, when the town's main water supply had been wiped out. The county had contracted me to help design and install that system. It wasn't just a fancy piece of infrastructure. It was literally the only way for the fire department to access the town's backup water supply during fire season. But Karen had no idea. She was too busy worrying about the visual harmony of the neighborhood to realize she had just locked up our town's lifeline. I stared at the lock, then back at Karen, who was already typing something into her phone, probably documenting her so-called victory. "I've documented your non-compliance," she chirped, completely oblivious to the gravity of what she had just done. The fire department had used that gate to get access to water during fires for the past 3 years. She had just blocked it off, and she had no idea. I stood there, silently cursing under my breath, while she sat smugly, probably planning her next step. Little did she know, this wasn't just a personal inconvenience. It could lead to a full-scale emergency if something happened. And it was all her fault. I was ready to take action. I could have ripped the lock off right then and there. I could have gone out and grabbed a bolt cutter, or even used my ATV to yank it off. But I didn't. I knew the town needed that water supply, and if something happened, if a fire broke out or a natural disaster hit, my property line could be the difference between saving lives or watching everything burn. I could feel the heat building in my chest. The town relied on that gate, and she had no idea. Instead, I stood there, watching her pull out her lawn chair like she was planning to take a nap across from my gate. She plopped down and started sipping kombucha, staring down anyone who dared to come near it, even trying to redirect an Amazon delivery guy to the non-existent back alley entrance. I just stood there, stunned. Was this really happening? But the heat wasn't just coming from Karen's ridiculous actions. It was coming from the weather too. The temperature was climbing fast, already pushing 103 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fire warnings were flashing on the local news. I figured it would blow over soon. Karen would get bored and leave. Worst case scenario, I'd give her a day to do her thing, and she'd move on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, that night, it happened. Lightning struck a ridge just a few miles away, and before I could even process it, the dry brush went up like gasoline-soaked confetti. The fire was spreading quickly, and I could already see the orange glow in the distance. The smoke didn't take long to reach my house, and before I knew it, the sirens were blaring. Fire trucks raced down the community trail toward the one access point they had, my gate. I raced to the gate, hoping to see someone with bolt cutters. But no, it was just Karen, still sitting in her lawn chair, now in a bathrobe, sipping wine like we weren't on the brink of disaster. One of the firefighters ran up, his eyes wide with urgency. "We need access to the valve now," he said. But Karen didn't even bat an eye. "This is private property," she said with a dismissive wave. "I can't allow anyone through without HOA clearance." I blinked. The firefighter blinked. We all blinked. And I couldn't stand it anymore. This was insane. I had to do something. I didn't wait for anyone to figure it out. I turned and ran to my shed, grabbed a chain and hooked it to my truck. I wasn't about to let her decision cost us everything. I hooked the chain to the lock and floored it, yanking that thing off with all the force my truck could muster. The sound of the metal snapping was the best thing I'd heard in days. The gate flew open, and the fire trucks roared through. The fire was contained, but not before one house up in the foothills was lost. The damage could have been worse. It was hard to even think about that. The next day, I was giving a statement to the local officials. And Karen? Well, she was nowhere to be found. But her padlock? I made sure to hang that thing on my porch with a sign that read, "Warning, may cause wildfires." The whole town was buzzing. They were starting to piece it together, realizing who had locked the gate and why. And soon enough, Karen's little kingdom was about to come crashing down. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. I figured with the fire contained and the emergency valve secured, everything would calm down, and Karen would realize how out of line she had been. But no, of course not. Instead, things were just beginning to spiral. It wasn't long before I saw the first signs of the fallout. Later that night, after the fire had been contained and the town had started to return to some sense of normalcy, I was still on edge. My phone was buzzing non-stop with messages from neighbors, from the fire department, even from local officials. Everyone was asking the same thing. What the hell happened with that gate? They had seen the fire truck stuck. They had felt the tension, and they wanted answers. But the one person who wasn't answering anything was Karen. She had disappeared the minute the fire was under control. I wasn't sure where she had gone, but I knew she wasn't coming back until she had her story straight. And whatever she was planning, it wasn't going to be pretty. The next morning, I thought maybe things would settle down. After all, it wasn't like anyone in the town was siding with her at this point. It was clear who had saved the day. But as soon as I walked into the diner, I knew I was wrong. The place went quiet the moment I stepped through the door. It wasn't the usual morning chatter or people chatting over coffee. It was a dead silence, like someone had pressed the mute button on a TV. I could feel every single eye in the room on me. Old men paused mid-bite. The waitress stopped mid-pour. Even Rosie, who ran the diner, set down her coffee pot with a clink. I could barely process the attention I was getting, but before I could even sit down, someone called out from the back, "You the guy with the gate?" I nodded, still feeling like I had just walked into some kind of interrogation room. Yeah, didn't realize locking a gate would turn into a town-wide scandal. One of the older women, who usually spent her time minding her own business and enjoying the peace, stood up and crossed her arms. It wouldn't have been a scandal if that woman hadn't locked the only access to our emergency water system, she said, her voice firm. My brother's house nearly went up in flames because of her. Another voice chimed in, someone I didn't recognize but who clearly had a lot of people's support. You know, Karen filed a complaint against you this morning. She said you damaged HOA property when you broke the lock. Sheriff already tossed it, but thought you should know. That got a few chuckles, but the laughter didn't last long. A man in overalls leaned over and whispered, "She's been calling herself the waterfront coordinator. Told my wife she had the authority to inspect our garden hose for non-compliance." I couldn't believe it. This was beyond ridiculous. As the morning wore on, I learned the full extent of Karen's crusade to improve the neighborhood. Apparently, she wasn't just obsessed with my gate. She had turned her focus on anything and everything she deemed aesthetically offensive to the HOA's visual standards. She'd been sending violation notices for things like untrimmed hedges, unauthorized lawn furniture, even a kid's basketball hoop that was apparently a hazard. People were furious. They just didn't have the nerve to stand up to her. But when the fire happened, things changed. The town had finally seen the consequences of Karen's overreach. No longer was she just an annoyance. She was a serious problem. And now, everyone wanted answers. By the time lunch rolled around, I got a call from Councilman Devers. His voice was direct and even a little strained. "You're the only one who knows what that gate is really for. We need to set the record straight before Karen spins this into something she can use to paint herself as the hero." That's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with a neighborhood Karen anymore. I was facing someone who was about to drag this entire town into a legal and bureaucratic nightmare if we didn't act fast. I agreed to meet with him, and later that evening, I showed up at Town Hall. The room was packed. People were lined up against the walls, others sat on the floor, and some had even spilled out into the hallway. And there she was, sitting in the front row, smug as ever, clipboard in hand like she was preparing for battle. The mayor kicked things off with a simple question. Can someone explain what happened at Gate E17 during yesterday's fire response? I stood up, feeling the weight of the entire town's curiosity on me. I laid out the facts. That gate wasn't just a private property access point. It was the only emergency access point for our town's backup water supply. I showed them the blueprints, the contracts, the official documents that tied it to the fire department's emergency response system. I explained how Karen's decision to lock it had directly obstructed emergency services, and that the consequences could have been catastrophic if the fire had spread further. Karen's face went pale as I laid it all out. She raised her hand, trying to interrupt, but the mayor silenced her. "Mrs. Travers, you'll have a chance to speak after Mr. Miller finishes." I turned to Karen, making sure everyone in the room understood exactly who was responsible. "You're right about one thing," I said. "It is private property, but it's also federally designated as a secondary access corridor for emergency utilities, which overrides any local or private governance, including the HOA. The room was silent. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen, however, didn't flinch. Instead, She tried to play it off. "I wasn't informed of any emergency use plans," she said, flipping her hair and trying to reclaim some of the authority she thought she still had. Perhaps the town should have communicated better. I couldn't believe it. This woman was trying to blame everyone else for her actions. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. That's when I dropped the bomb. I pulled out the emails from 2018, showing that the town had notified the HOA about the emergency access easement. And not just that, but the previous HOA board had signed off on it, agreeing to maintain unobstructed access in perpetuity. "I have the documents right here," I said, handing them to the council. The room went dead silent as the documents passed around, and I watched as Karen's face went from confident to visibly anxious. But I wasn't done. I had one more thing to show. I reached into my folder and pulled out a copy of the inspection report for the valve system, which had been upgraded in 2021 with federal grant money. The document classified it as a Homeland Security asset under Regional Infrastructure Protection. Blocking access to this valve isn't just a violation of local codes, it's a potential federal violation, I said. Karen's face turned white as a sheet. She tried to interrupt again, but the mayor cut her off. "Enough. We've heard quite enough," he said. The room broke into applause. I could barely believe it. People were finally seeing Karen for who she really was. Someone who cared more about control and power than the safety of the community. And just like that, she was done. The town had had enough. But that wasn't the end of it. Oh no. Karen had one last card to play. Despite everything that had just happened, despite the public shaming, she wasn't going to give up. And what happened next was even more infuriating. The next morning, I got a letter from the HOA board telling me that I was being fined $800 for unauthorized demolition of HOA-installed hardware. They were actually trying to punish me for saving the town. It was at that moment that I realized this wasn't going to end with the town hall vote. Karen wasn't done, and neither was I. The next few days were a whirlwind. The fallout from the town hall meeting hadn't even begun to settle when the real consequences started to unfold. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, with Karen as the unwilling conductor, oblivious to the disaster she had set in motion. Word of her actions had spread like wildfire through the town, and everyone was talking. People who had once been too afraid to speak up against her were now openly expressing their frustration. Karen, the so-called waterfront coordinator, had become the town pariah, and the reality of her overreach was sinking in. But Karen wasn't backing down. No, she was doing what Karen does best, digging in her heels and trying to rewrite the narrative. The day after the town hall, I woke up to find a letter from the HOA board in my mailbox. I ripped open the envelope, half expecting something ridiculous, and sure enough, they didn't disappoint. The letter claimed I was being fined $800 for unauthorized demolition of HOA-installed hardware and for vehicular misuse on shared land. It felt like a slap in the face. They were actually trying to punish me for saving the town. I couldn't believe it. Here I was, standing in the aftermath of an emergency that could have been much worse, and they were going after me. But this wasn't just about me. It was about principle. I wasn't about to let this slide. I had documents, contracts, and blueprints to prove I had done nothing wrong. But Karen, she had been trying to pull the strings behind the scenes for months, and now, with her little HOA board stacked with people who either owed her favors or were too afraid to speak up, she was doubling down. She wasn't done with me yet. But I wasn't done either. I called my friend Darren, a local paralegal who owed me a favor from when I helped him set up a grey water system at his cabin. He picked up on the first ring, and without any hesitation, I filled him in on the letter and the fines. "Let me guess," he said with a chuckle. "Karen's still making life miserable, huh?" "Yeah, but this time she's going too far," I replied. "She's trying to fine me for breaking a lock that was literally blocking an emergency access point. They're twisting the facts, Darren. I need you to help me find a way to fight back. Darren didn't hesitate. You bring the files. I'll bring the popcorn. Let's dig into this. An hour later, we were sitting at his office, papers strewn across the table like we were planning some kind of heist. Darren was flipping through the HOA's complaint and laughing under his breath. Man, she's really reaching, isn't she? Look at this. She's citing HOA codes from the 1980s. Half of this stuff isn't even enforceable anymore. He grinned. We can hit back, no problem. And we're going to start with this. He pulled up a scanned PDF on his computer, a copy of the original easement agreement from 2017, signed by the previous HOA president. This easement is still active, Darren said, tapping the screen. Right here, it says, perpetual emergency access shall not be obstructed or regulated by private associations or individuals. That's gold, my friend. You're not just dealing with Karen, you're dealing with a federal violation. I leaned back in my chair, the realization settling in. Karen's actions hadn't just violated some neighborhood code. She had obstructed a federal utility. This wasn't petty anymore. This was a full-on legal battle. The implications were huge. If she had really gone that far, she wasn't just stepping on toes, she was breaking laws. Darren's eyes sparkled with the thrill of it. I knew we had her, but we're not stopping there. Check this out. He clicked through a few more files and pulled up a map of the county's emergency infrastructure zones. Your gate isn't just important, it's flagged as a critical access point tied to FEMA-funded upgrades. That means blocking it wasn't just a violation of local codes. This is a federal violation. We've got everything we need to bring her down. I felt the adrenaline kick in. This was it. We were about to hit her where it would hurt the most. And what was even better, if we played this right, we could get the HOA in trouble too. Darren knew it, and I could tell he was loving every minute of it. We weren't just going to roll over and let her continue her reign of petty terror. But Darren wasn't done. Oh, we've got more. I've been keeping an eye on the HOA's internal communications. Check this out. He pulled up an email thread, the screen filled with messages from Karen and some of her supporters within the board. One email stood out. Karen had written, "We locked it." He can't prove it's a federal easement, and even if he tries, it'll take months to sort out. By then, he'll either cave or rack up so many fines he'll beg to comply. I read it, feeling my blood boil. There it was. The proof that Karen had knowingly locked the gate, and her entire plan was to drag things out until I was forced to give in. She had underestimated me, though. We weren't going to just let her get away with this. We had her dead to rights. Darren chuckled darkly. She's not just a Karen, man. She's playing Game of Thrones with lawn chairs. This is like watching a bad soap opera, but with more legal jargon and fewer believable characters. I laughed, but inside I was already plotting how to hit her where it would hurt most. So, what do we do now? We hit her with everything, Darren said, grinning. We go straight to the county zoning office, file a complaint, and then we drop this bomb with the Regional Infrastructure Authority. Let them know what she's been up to. The fire marshal will love this. By the end of the day, we had submitted our formal complaint to the county zoning office and sent a report to the Regional Infrastructure Authority. And just as we finished, I received a call from the fire marshal. "Jordan," he said, his voice serious. "I've got news. We're referring this to the State Emergency Oversight Committee. This is bigger than we thought. You might want to stay out of her way for a bit." I had to laugh at the timing. Just as Karen thought she was getting away with it, the state was stepping in. I knew it was only a matter of time before the walls started closing in on her. But Karen, ever the stubborn force, wasn't done. She still thought she had the upper hand. Less than an hour later, she showed up at my door. No clipboard this time, just a smug look on her face and a stack of glossy folders under her arm. She wasn't here to apologize. Oh no, Karen didn't do apologies. I'm here to discuss your behavior, she said. No greeting, no pleasantries. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Karen, you do realize you're under investigation by 3 different government departments, right? She didn't flinch. Instead, she tossed a folder at my feet. That's your official summons to the HOA disciplinary hearing. Refusal to attend will result in escalated fines. I picked up the folder, opened it, and laughed. You scheduled this for Thursday? Good timing. That's the same day you're getting served. I closed the door in her face without another word. The next day, I watched from my porch as 2 county officials walked up to Karen's house. She answered the door in a pink bathrobe, clearly caught off guard. They handed her the file, and from the look on her face, I could tell this was the beginning of the end. But Karen still wasn't finished. 2 hours later, I received an email with a subject line that made my stomach drop. HOA board proposes temporary suspension of easement agreement pending legal clarification. I couldn't believe it. Karen was escalating. She wasn't backing down. She was doubling down, and this time she was playing a dangerous game. I knew we were reaching the boiling point. Karen had no idea what she was stirring up with that email about the easement suspension, but I did. The HOA was trying to cover their tracks, hoping to buy more time, to figure out a way to keep her in power without the town realizing just how far they'd let her go. They were either too intimidated by her, or too deep in her web to see the mess she had created. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I was done waiting for someone else to fix this. It was time for me to take matters into my own hands. I immediately called Darren. You see that email? I asked him, barely keeping the frustration out of my voice. Yeah, I saw it, he replied, his tone low. She's trying to derail everything. She thinks if she confuses enough people, she can wiggle her way out of this. It's not going to work, though. We've got the goods on her and we're not backing down. I ran my hand over my face, trying to keep my thoughts clear. I'm going to need you to pull everything you've got. Those emails, the map, the easement agreements. We're going after her directly. This ends now. Darren didn't hesitate. I'm on it. I'll get everything ready. We'll make sure the county knows exactly what's going on. Less than an hour later, we were back at Darren's office, surrounded by a pile of papers. I started reviewing the HOA's bylaws again, trying to find any loophole that would let us force their hand. That's when I found it. A clause buried deep in the bylaws that hadn't been used in over 20 years. A clause that allowed homeowners to call for an emergency vote to replace any board member who posed demonstrable harm to the community's safety or reputation. This was exactly what Karen had done. She had endangered the town, put people's lives at risk, and caused chaos across the community. This was the perfect opportunity to strike back. I pulled the document from the pile and showed it to Darren. This is it. We don't need to wait for the legal system to act. We can push for a vote right now. We'll get enough signatures, and Karen will be out of the board for good. Darren grinned. Let's do it. I've got your back. It wasn't easy, but we gathered enough signatures in just 2 days. The town had seen enough, and people were ready for change. We took the signed petitions to the town hall, and the meeting was scheduled for the following week. As soon as that news hit, it was like a tidal wave of support rolled in. The town was done with Karen. They knew what she had done, and they were ready to hold her accountable. By the time the vote rolled around, there was a sense of energy in the air. People from all corners of the town showed up to support the motion to remove Karen from the board. The meeting was packed, standing room only. I could see the tension in the air. Karen was there, of course, sitting in the front row, her eyes narrowed as she gripped her clipboard like it was her only lifeline. When the vote began, it was almost surreal. I stepped forward, clutching my stack of papers. The emails, the easement documents, the legal paperwork that proved Karen had knowingly violated federal regulations. I laid it all out for the council, for the room full of people who were watching closely. I wasn't making this about petty drama. I was making it about the safety of the community. I explained how Karen had blocked access to a critical infrastructure point, how she had ignored all the legal obligations in place to protect us during an emergency. Karen tried to interrupt, of course. She raised her hand like she was still in charge, trying to dispute every fact I presented. But this time, no one was listening to her. The more I spoke, the clearer it became. Her grip on the HOA was slipping fast. The room was starting to feel like a pressure cooker about to explode. People were visibly annoyed with her, and I could see it in their eyes. They were done with her. Then it was time for the vote. One by one, the council members cast their votes, and when it was over, the results were clear. Karen was officially removed from the board. I didn't feel a sense of triumph as I thought I might. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. The people had spoken, and justice had been served. Karen's reign of petty power was over, and now it was time to rebuild. But of course, this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Karen wasn't going to walk away quietly. That night, she showed up at my door again, her face red with fury, the clipboard still in hand. "I can't believe this," she spat. "You have no idea what you've done. You've made an enemy of me, and you'll regret this." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Karen, you've been an enemy to this town for far too long. The only thing you should regret is thinking you could get away with this. It's over." She didn't respond, just stormed off like a petulant child who didn't get her way. But as much as I was relieved, I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to find a stack of legal papers in my mailbox. More fines, more threats. The HOA wasn't backing down just because Karen was gone. But now, I had the upper hand. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me into submission. I reached out to Darren once again. "They're trying to find a way to make me pay, but I'm not backing down. What's next?" Darren didn't hesitate. "We're going after them too. We've got enough ammo to make sure they never try anything like this again. Let's file a formal challenge to the fines. Let's make sure the HOA knows we're not going away." We filed the challenge, and the tension only grew from there. But I knew we were winning. Slowly but surely the tide was turning. The people of the town were rallying behind me. Even those who had been silent during Karen's reign were now coming forward, offering their support. Then, one day, a surprise arrived at my door. It was a letter from the HOA, acknowledging the situation and agreeing to reconsider the temporary suspension of the easement. They didn't just drop the fines, they officially apologized for the mess. The letter stated that the board had agreed to pay for the damages done to my property, and even agreed to cover the cost of upgrading the gate. I couldn't believe it. After everything we had been through, the fines, the threats, the endless paperwork, it was over. But what struck me the most was the apology. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the people taking responsibility for their actions. And in that moment, I knew the town was finally free from the control Karen had held for so long. But the final twist came when the fire department decided to hold a public demonstration of the new emergency access system. They had installed a smart lock on the gate, allowing them immediate access in case of another emergency. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for the entire town. The new system meant no one would ever be in a position to lock that gate again. The fire department could respond faster, and we could all rest a little easier knowing our emergency infrastructure was finally secure. As I stood there watching the demonstration, a plaque was handed to me, recognizing me as the community safety guardian. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. I wasn't doing it for recognition. I was doing it to protect the town, to ensure no one would ever be able to undermine our safety again. But Karen, of course, was still around. She showed up at the event, standing off to the side, trying to remain inconspicuous. I could see her watching from the edge of the crowd, still clinging to whatever dignity she had left. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But that didn't last long. The next week, the town held an emergency meeting to thank everyone who had helped during the fire, including me. The mayor gave a short speech, acknowledging my role in saving the town's infrastructure, and the whole crowd cheered. Karen didn't say a word. She stood there, arms crossed, looking like a child who had just been caught misbehaving. As I walked off the stage, I saw her watching me. But this time, I wasn't worried. I knew she wasn't in control anymore. She had made her move, and it had backfired spectacularly. I got back to my normal routine after that. The town felt calmer. People were no longer whispering behind each other's backs, and the community felt like a community again. It was like a heavy fog had lifted. As for Karen, well, I heard she tried to organize some private neighborhood improvement committee, but it went nowhere. People were done listening to her. They saw her for what she really was, and they weren't willing to give her the power she had once held. Life returned to normal. But every time I drive past that gate, I can't help but smile. It stands there, smart lock blinking softly, a reminder of how one woman's petty obsession nearly caused a disaster, and how, with a little grit and a lot of paperwork, we stopped it from happening.